Hello health champions, today I want to talk about ketones. Is ketosis an extreme and dangerous state, or are ketones safe and maybe even a superior fuel for the brain? Coming right up. Hey, I'm Dr. Ekberg. I'm a holistic doctor and a former Olympic decathlete. And if you want to truly master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss anything. Even though the ketogenic diet and ketones have become popular because they help people lose weight, the most significant thing about ketones is that they are an alternative fuel for the brain. And because ketones can fuel the brain when we have a scarcity of foods, then they act as a survival mechanism. It is one of the most important things humans have learned to do to survive whenever there's a scarcity of carbohydrate or even in certain low oxygen environment. Ketones and the ketogenic diet have been called a fad. So a lot of people think that ketones, that must be a rather new thing. But actually, bacteria and something called archaea, a very primitive life form, dating back 2 to 3 billion years, were using ketones for fuel. So ketone was one of the foundations of life on the planet. But how come so many people are still afraid of ketones as something dangerous and extreme? And they think that eating frequent meals and lots of carbohydrate is a good thing. Well, as long as we have been on the planet, humans and every other species, the key to survival has been to find enough food to survive. And when we didn't, when there's a lack of food, then humans and other species starve to death. And then, of course, when food is available, we want to eat as much as possible and as frequently as possible to put on some fat so we can survive the next famine. Fasting and starvation, on the other hand, whether it's involuntary or voluntary, is when the body makes ketones. And when we're nearly starving to death is when the body makes the most ketones. So then it's easy to make that association that ketones would be something bad and something extreme that we should avoid at all costs. Now, after thousands of years living in hostile environment, fighting for our survival, it's not so strange that we appreciate a little bit of comfort. I mean, who wouldn't prefer this nice table over sitting hungry in a damp cave? But maybe we are becoming a little too comfortable. Interestingly, they have found in research, especially in the field of anti-aging and longevity research, that if you struggle a little bit, if the body becomes a little uncomfortable, like if you're starving or if you're missing a few meals on purpose, like in intermittent fasting, or if you're running for your life, or if you're doing it on purpose, like in high-intensity interval training, those are some of the best things that you can do for your health because it activates survival genes. When your body fears for its life, when you punish it a little bit, when it suffers a little bit, now it has a reason to get better. It upregulates growth hormone, it upregulates immunity, all of those things that we've talked about before with autophagy and so forth. Whereas if we have too much comfort, now the body has no reason to get better. And without any challenges, then the body becomes complacent and we start the process of degeneration. Most of the organs and tissues in the body, like heart and lungs and intestines, they can use a variety of fuel. They can use things like fat and protein, but the brain can't use fat or protein. The brain can only burn glucose and ketones. And when there is plenty of food, when there is plenty of carbohydrates, then the brain is going to run on virtually 100% glucose. However, when there is a scarcity, now the body has that backup fuel, the ketones, and they can provide as much as 75% of the fuel for the brain, leaving only 25% to be covered by glucose. The brain is a greedy master. Even though everything in the body depends on everything else, so the brain isn't a master in the sense that other things are unimportant, The brain does regulate everything in the body, and it makes sure that it gets fed first. So the brain is only about 2% of your body weight, but it uses 20% of your energy. 20% of all the calories and oxygen and the fuel in the body is used up by that small brain. For the average person, that 20% comes out to about 400 to 500 calories. And if we're running on glucose alone, that's about 100 to 125 grams of glucose, because there's 4 calories per gram of glucose. Whereas if we're in ketosis, if we are supplying ketones to fuel the brain, we only need 25% of that, which is 25 to 30 grams. But when we're in a ketogenic state, or if we're fasting, whether we're eating less carbs or not eating anything at all, those 25 to 30 grams have to come from somewhere. And if we're not eating any, where do they come from? So now the body resorts to something called gluconeogenesis. And that is exactly what it sounds like. Glucose is sugar, neo is new, and genesis is make. So it's making glucose from scratch, basically. And when we're not eating anything, the body has 2 sources to make glucose. One is from protein, because protein can break down to amino acids, and amino acids can turn into glucose. And the other, of course, is from fat, where the glycerol can be turned into glucose. So when you look over here, this is a triglyceride. This is how fat is stored on the body, and this is how fat is ingested. When you eat dietary fat, then virtually all of that is in the form of triglycerides. So the white squiggly lines here, they are the fatty acids. They can be burned as fat, give us 9 calories per gram, but they cannot turn into glucose at all. However, this little backbone that holds the triglyceride together, that's the glycerol. And this is a 3-carbon chain, and those carbons can go back in and make glucose. And why am I making a big deal out of that? What is the huge, enormous significance of that little tidbit? It is that even when you're not eating, then you're burning fat, and when you're breaking down fat, that glycerol can become glucose. So when you are fat adapted and burning enough fat, then you don't have to use amino acids. You don't have to break down protein to make glucose. So this is muscle sparing. We don't have to use protein for fuel. Humans are unique in many ways, but the most unique thing about humans is our brain. There are many different features. The first is that we have one of the largest brains relative to the body size. Secondly, we have the most folded brain. The surface of the brain is like a walnut. It goes in and out. And that's to increase the surface area so that we can fit a larger number of neurons, brain cells, on that surface, and we can interconnect them with more synapses, more connections, so we can make more complex neural networks, and we can do things that no other species can do. We also have a much bigger frontal lobe than any other species, and the frontal lobe is what makes us human. That's where we can do abstract thought and planning and motivation, and we can think forward and about things. This big and unique brain also requires a lot of energy. Like we said, the adult brain uses up 20% of all your energy. And this comes with some challenges, because if you have a big brain and there is no food available, then the brain still has to have its fuel. So now if you want to survive, then you have 2 choices. You can either shrink the brain, sort of devolve, or you can get better at making ketones. You can develop an alternative fuel, and you can get better at that. The only life form that uses more energy for the brain than the adult human is, of course, the baby human. And the body of a baby is only 5% of its adult weight, but the brain is already 20%. So relatively speaking, the baby's brain is 4 times larger than the adult brain, which means that the infant requires 60 to 70% of all the energy consumed to fuel the brain. And here we get even more evidence of how smart nature is. So because the baby brain needs that much energy, the baby is born in ketosis. And the colostrum, the mother's milk for the first couple of days, is much higher in protein and fat than the mother's milk a week or 2 or 3 into the process. So lactose, the sugar in milk, which is going to be a major source of fuel for the baby later on, takes about 3 days to kick in. So in the beginning, while everything is getting established, the baby is in ketosis and it's using mostly protein and fat. The baby human is also the fattest species on the planet at birth. 15% body fat is astronomical for a baby. As a comparison, baby seals are born at 10%, and most mammals are born at 2 to 3%, including monkeys and chimpanzees. They're very, very lean when they're born. But the human is born prematurely, it is born with a huge brain, and it needs some fat reserves. It needs some energy reserves just in case there's not an immediate food supply the first few days after birth. So this fat can keep the brain fed and also provide some energy for the rest of the body to grow and develop the organs. Now, if fasting produces ketones, then wouldn't you think that the master of fasting, the bear, which hibernates, means it's sleeping for up to half the year, and during that time it eats nothing. So on a regular basis, it fasts for 6 months. Do you think that would produce a lot of ketones? Well, actually, it doesn't. So for humans, when you're less than 0.5 millimoles of ketones, you're not considered to be in ketosis. And bears do not get over half a millimole. Adult humans, in comparison, can get much higher levels, 2 to 3 millimoles, and we don't have to fast for months to accomplish that. 2 to 3 days is enough to get up to those levels, and if we fast for a week or 10 days, then we can double those levels. So what about a baby whose brains are so dependent on fuel? Well, a baby can get up to 2 to 3 millimoles in a matter of hours. 2 to 3 hours of not being fed, and the baby is already in a very deep state of ketosis. So where does the bear brain get the fuel? Well, remember this triglyceride that we can break down the fatty acids for energy, and then we have a little bit of glycerol left over that can turn into glucose. And it turns out that the yellow portion, the glycerol, accounts for about 5%. So out of the fat tissue, we can make about 5% of the calories turn into glucose. And that is plenty for the bear, because the bear brain, it has a huge body using up a lot of fat, but the brain is relatively small, requiring less than 5% of the energy in the body. So the glucose coming from glycerol in the bear is more than enough to provide the brain with fuel. So it doesn't need ketones. Humans, on the other hand, like we've said, need about 20% of the energy to fuel the brain. So there's no way to get that from glucose alone, and therefore we depend on the alternative fuel. So 75% of our fuel comes from ketones. And then, of course, the baby, which uses much, much more fuel for the brain, is even more dependent on ketones, so they develop even faster. Then, are there any other benefits besides survival? Well, dementia and neurodegeneration have been so closely linked to insulin resistance that they often refer to dementia as type 3 diabetes today. So what's going on there? Well, when you are insulin resistant, when your tissues in your body becomes insulin resistant and it goes on for a while, then mostly the brain also becomes insulin resistant. And if you have a metabolism where you're not making ketones, then the brain is 100% dependent on glucose. But if you're insulin resistant, even though your glucose levels, your blood glucose is high, then the brain is still starving. It can't get enough fuel because of this metabolic imbalance. So now if you go on a ketogenic diet, or if you fast and you become fat adapted, now you can fuel your brain with up to 75% ketones. You're providing an alternative fuel that doesn't need insulin to enter the cells. So even if you're insulin resistant, it doesn't affect the ketones. It can bypass that insulin resistant, and now you can fuel your brain with ketones. And this is probably the mechanism why a lot of people in ketosis notice less brain fog. They notice they improve focus and clarity. For some people who do the ketogenic diet to lose weight, they might be surprised that one of the greatest unexpected benefits is that their brains start working better. They also notice improved memory a lot of times and improved energy. So not only are ketones safe and natural, but they have played a key role in helping the human species survive to this day. And even more importantly, by replacing glucose as the primary fuel for the brain, ketones have allowed brain size to become the most significant factor in human evolution. In other words, without developing this ability of producing ketones and using them for brain fuel, humans would never have been able to evolve to who we are today. So if you appreciate your cell phone and your computer and your freezer and your car and your coffee maker, then make sure you thank ketones for that. And if you still run into some well-meaning, loving, but uninformed person who tries to scare you away from ketones, then just send them a link to this video. If you enjoyed this video, then I think you're really gonna love that one next. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.